The shame of it was a physical weight. Annalise Vance felt it settle on her shoulders, a shroud woven from whispers and sidelong glances. The ballroom was a galaxy of glittering chandeliers and shimmering silks, but for her, it was a pillory. Her dress, a pale blue silk from 3 seasons past, had been her mother's. It was her best, and it was not nearly good enough. A clumsy waltzer, spinning out from the dance floor with more enthusiasm than grace, had caught the hem on his boot buckle. The sound of the fabric tearing was a small, private catastrophe, a sound only she had heard. But the result, a jagged rip that exposed the frayed petticoat beneath, was devastatingly public. She had tried to retreat, to melt into the shadowed alcoves where the wallflowers and chaperones congregated like moss on the forgotten side of a stone. But there was no real escape. Her uncle, Marcus Vance, had insisted she attend. He insisted she be seen. His own finances, a ship taking on water, required the ballast of a wealthy match for his niece. Annalise was the cargo he intended to trade for his salvation, and her own feelings on the matter were irrelevant. She was 24, an age when spinsterhood began to cling to a woman like frost. Her value on the marriage market was plummeting, and the torn dress felt like a final damning advertisement of their family's decline. She stood near a pillar, trying to arrange the ruined folds of her skirt to conceal the damage. Her fingers trembled. Each beat of the orchestra felt like a hammer blow against her temples. She was a ghost at this feast, a silent observer of a life she could never truly join. Her world had shrunk to the size of their small mortgaged townhouse, to the quiet ticking of clocks and the ever-growing stack of unpaid bills on her uncle's desk. Hope was a luxury she had long since learned to do without. Resignation was her only companion. Then the room shifted, a subtle change in the air, a parting of the crowd as if by an invisible tide. Duke Alistair Beaumont had arrived. He was not a man who entered a room, he commanded it. Tall and severe, with a face that looked as though it were carved from granite, he moved with an unnerving economy of motion. Annalise had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. He was impossibly wealthy, his fortune rooted in shipping and industry, a new kind of power that made the old aristocracy nervous. He was ruthless in business, solitary in his habits, and utterly uninterested in the frivolities of the ton. She watched him from behind her pillar, a moth observing a flame. She noticed a detail others might miss, the faint, dark stains on the tips of his fingers, as if he spent his days not with riding crops and wine glasses, but with ink and ledgers. He spoke briefly to their host, his voice a low murmur that did not carry. His eyes, a startlingly dark blue, swept the room with an unnerving lack of interest. They were the eyes of a man assessing assets, not enjoying a party. Annalise pressed herself further into the shadows, willing herself to become part of the damask wallpaper. But fate, in its infinite cruelty, had other plans. The Duke turned from his host and began to move along the edge of the room, his path taking him directly toward her alcove. Her heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. He was not looking for anyone, merely moving away from the crush of people. He was almost past her when his gaze fell. It was not a lingering look. It was a brief, sharp assessment. His eyes flickered from her face, pale with anxiety, down to the disaster of her skirt. For a single, suspended moment, there was silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. Annalise felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck, so intense it was almost painful. And then he laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was not a chuckle of shared amusement. It was a short, sharp, brutal sound. Laughter like the crack of a whip. It was cold and dismissive, and it sliced through the genteel chatter of the ballroom like a shard of glass. Every head within earshot turned. They saw the formidable Duke Beaumont, and they followed his gaze to the source of his contempt, the shabby girl with the torn dress, cowering by a pillar. The whispers that followed were worse than the laugh itself. Annalise felt hundreds of eyes on her, stripping her bare. The pity, the scorn, the faint, cruel smiles. It was a social execution. The Duke did not linger to observe the carnage he had wrought. He simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head and continued on his way, leaving her to drown in the silence his laughter had created. Annalise did not remember leaving the ball. She must have walked, must have found her wrap, must have somehow navigated the path to the street where her uncle's hired carriage waited. The journey home was a blur of silent tears and a pain so profound it felt like a physical wound. The Duke had not just laughed at her dress, he had laughed at her poverty, at her desperation, at her very existence. He had held her up for the entire world to see, and he had found her worthless. That night, huddled in her cold bed, Annalise Vance did not wish for a better life. She wished for no life at all. 3 days passed in a haze of misery. Her uncle was apoplectic, not at her humiliation, but at the damage it had done to her prospects. Utterly ruined, he had seethed, pacing the worn carpet of the drawing room. Beaumont himself. How could you be so careless? As if the torn fabric were a failing of her character. On the 4th day, a carriage pulled up outside their townhouse. It was not a hired hack. It was a lacquered black coach, gleaming and impossibly grand, pulled by 4 perfectly matched grey horses. On its door was a crest that made Annalise's breath catch in her throat. The crest of the Duke of Beaumont. A footman delivered a card, not to her uncle but to her, Lady Annalise Vance, her name penned in a strong, dark script. Her uncle snatched it from her, but the footman was firm. The Duke requests a private audience with Lady Annalise. Marcus paled. A private audience could mean only one thing: a demand for an apology, a further dressing down for some perceived slight. But he could not refuse a duke. Annalise was ushered into their own small, shabby drawing room, her hands clammy, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Duke Alistair Beaumont filled the room. He seemed even taller, more imposing, in the cramped space. He stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the dreary street. He still wore the faint armour of his severity, and the ink stains were still visible on his fingertips. "Lady Annalise," he said, without turning. His voice was the same low, controlled tone from the ball. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He turned then, and his dark blue eyes met hers. There was no apology in them, no warmth. There was only an unnerving, direct intensity. "I have come to make you a proposition." Annalise stared, bewildered. "A proposition?" "I wish for you to become my wife," he stated, the words falling into the quiet room with the weight of stones. The shock of it was so absolute that for a moment Annalise thought she had misheard. This had to be a joke. A new, more elaborate form of cruelty. You cannot be serious," she stammered. "You laughed at me." The words were an accusation, small and trembling. "I did," he conceded, without a flicker of remorse. "My reasons were my own. They have no bearing on this offer. This is madness," she said, finding a sliver of strength in her disbelief. "Why would you possibly wish to marry me? A woman you publicly humiliated, because it is convenient," he said, his tone that of a man discussing a business merger. "I require a wife, a duchess, someone quiet, unobtrusive, who will not interfere with my life or my work. You, Lady Annalise, have been rendered socially invisible by my own hand. No one will question why you would accept my offer. Your uncle is in financial ruin. You have no prospects. This marriage would be a rescue that felt like a drowning. And what do I gain? Aside from the privilege of being your quiet, unobtrusive possession?" The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his face before it was extinguished. "You would gain security, Your uncle's debts would be settled. You would have a home, a title, and a fortune at your disposal. You would want for nothing, materially. In exchange, he continued, I would require your discretion. We would live in the same house, but we would lead separate lives. It would be a partnership, not a romance, a contract. Anneliese looked around the small, faded room, at the threadbare furniture that represented her entire world. She thought of her uncle's rages, of the pitying looks, of the crushing, hopeless weight of her future. The Duke's offer was cold, insulting, bizarre, but it was also a door. A strange, dark door out of the prison her life had become. She had nothing. He was offering her something. I will not be a prisoner in your home, Your Grace, she said, her voice steadier now. I will not be a decorative object you keep locked away. You will be the Duchess of Beaumont, he replied. The household will be your domain. Your time will be your own. My only condition is that you do not seek to pry into my affairs. She looked at him, this cold, inscrutable man who had shattered her world and was now offering to rebuild it in a shape of his own choosing. She had no other options. Survival was a powerful motivator. And I have a condition of my own, she said, surprising herself again. He raised a single, dark eyebrow. One day, she said, her gaze unwavering, you will tell me why you laughed. He was silent for a long moment. The arrangement is acceptable, he said finally, as if agreeing to the price of a commodity. We will be married by special license within the week. He bowed, a brief, formal inclination of his head, and was gone. Anneliese sank into a chair, her body trembling. She had just agreed to marry the man who had destroyed her. The ducal mansion on Grosvenor Square was less a home than a monument. It was a vast, silent palace of marble and mahogany, where footsteps echoed and the servants moved like spectres. Anneliese, now the Duchess of Beaumont, felt like the smallest, most insignificant object within its walls. Her new life was one of surreal emptiness. Alistair was true to his word. He was a ghost in his own house, a polite stranger with whom she shared occasional, silent dinners. He would appear in the dining room precisely at 8, his fingers often still faintly smudged with ink. He would inquire formally after her day. She would give a brief, equally formal reply. They would eat, surrounded by a dozen empty chairs, the only sounds the clink of silver on porcelain. Then he would bow his head slightly and retreat to his study, and she would often hear the soft, final sound of a key turning in the lock. The sound became the punctuation mark of her evenings, the closing of a door, the sealing of a secret. Yet, in the cold formality, there were cracks, small, inexplicable moments that contradicted the man he presented to the world. One afternoon, she found a rare book on ornithology left on the table in her private sitting room, the very book she had once mentioned in passing to her uncle months ago. There was no note, no explanation. It was simply there. Another time, during a chilly evening, a footman appeared with a heavy cashmere shawl, informing her that His Grace had noticed she seemed cold and had instructed him to fetch it. Alistair was nowhere in sight. He observed her from a distance, his care as remote and impersonal as the stars. She began to watch him in return. From the window of her room, she could sometimes see him in the gardens late at night, walking the stone paths alone, a solitary figure lost in thought. She saw the exhaustion that sometimes etched fine lines around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders as he pored over the ledgers and maps that covered his desk. This was not a man enjoying his immense wealth. This was a man carrying a burden. Her own days were filled with a strange, hollow freedom. She had access to unlimited funds, a beautiful carriage, a wardrobe filled with exquisite gowns. She could have anything she wanted, except connection, except answers. The ton, once so quick to scorn her, now fawned over the new Duchess. She accepted their invitations with cool grace, a perfect, remote figure at Alistair's side when protocol demanded, but she felt more an actress playing a part than a woman living a life. In the privacy of her rooms, she kept her one true possession from her old life, a small, intricately carved wooden bird, worn smooth with handling. It was the last gift her father had given her before he died, a testament to his gentle, artistic nature that had been so ill-suited to the world of commerce. One evening, Alistair entered her sitting room unexpectedly to retrieve a misplaced document. He stopped short, his eyes fixed on the little bird she held in her hand. A strange, unreadable expression passed over his face, a flicker of pain or recognition, so swift she almost missed it. He said nothing, simply took his papers and left, but the moment lingered in her mind. Her curiosity about him began to outweigh her resentment. He was a puzzle she could not help but try to solve. The cold, ruthless Duke, the man who left thoughtful gifts, the solitary figure walking in the dark. Who was Alistair Beaumont? And what was the secret he guarded so fiercely behind that locked study door? The first intrusion from her past life came in the form of her uncle, Marcus Vance. His debts paid by the Duke as promised, was not content. He arrived at the mansion one afternoon, his face a mixture of avarice and resentment. He had expected to be the brother-in-law of a duke, a position of influence and endless credit. Instead, he found himself cut off, a footnote in his niece's new life. "Annalise," he began, his tone falsely warm as she received him in a small, formal salon. "You are looking well. The ducal air suits you." "Uncle," she replied, her voice cool. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit? I merely came to see how you are settled, and to discuss a small matter of business, a venture I am pursuing. It requires a minor investment. Something a man of the Duke's means would hardly notice." He smiled, a greasy, conspiratorial expression. "Alistair's finances are not my concern," she said flatly, "and I have no funds of my own to offer you." His face hardened. "Do not forget, girl, who you are. You are my blood. It was I who raised you. You owe me." His voice rose, regaining its familiar hectoring tone. "This cold act does not become you. You are a Vance. You are nothing without the family that, I believe the Duchess indicated that the conversation is over." Alistair's voice cut through the room like a winter wind. He stood in the doorway, his presence sucking all the warmth from the air. He had not been there a moment before. He moved with a predator's silence. Marcus stammered, his bravado evaporating. "Your Grace, I was just having a family chat with my niece." "Your business with this family is concluded," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. He took a step into the room. "You will not call on her again. You will not write to her. You will not speak her name in connection with any of your ventures. Am I understood?" Marcus, sweating now, could only nod. He all but fled the room. Annalise stood frozen. Alistair had defended her ruthlessly and completely, yet his face was a cold mask. He turned to her. "He will not trouble you again." It was a statement of fact, not reassurance. He started to leave. "Wait," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Thank you." He paused, his back to her. "My wife's peace is a component of our arrangement. I was simply maintaining the terms of our contract." He walked away without another word, leaving her alone in the silent room. It was a protective act, yet it felt as impersonal as the settling of a debt. It only deepened the mystery. A seed of resolve took root in her. She would not be a passive beneficiary of his protection. She had been a pawn in her uncle's schemes for too long. A few days later, feigning an errand, she took a carriage to the old neighborhood, to the solicitor who had handled her father's meager estate. She told him she was merely settling a final, sentimental account. From him, she learned the name of her uncle's primary creditor, a moneylender with a dubious reputation. That evening, She overheard two footmen discussing a commotion at the tradesman's entrance. A man had been trying to see the Duke, shouting about being ruined. She recognized the name they mentioned. It was the moneylender. A cold realization dawned on her. Her uncle had not simply been in debt. He had been desperate. And he had used her, his ward, as his last piece of collateral. Armed with this sliver of knowledge, she understood that Alistair's protection, however cold, was all that stood between her and a fate far worse than a loveless marriage. But she also understood that she could not depend on it forever. She had to find her own strength, her own leverage. She had to uncover the truth, not just for her own sake, but to finally understand the man she had married. She had to find a way to get past that locked door. The opportunity came weeks later, during a storm that rattled the very windows of the mansion. A messenger had arrived late, soaked to the skin, with an urgent dispatch from Liverpool. Alistair had been in his study all evening. Annalise, unable to sleep, was reading in the library when he emerged. He looked pale, his jaw tight with strain. "One of my ships," he said, his voice clipped, almost to himself. "It has run aground on the Irish coast. The cargo may be lost." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of agitation. He was distracted, his formidable control fractured by the crisis. This was her chance. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at her, his eyes unfocused for a moment, as if seeing her for the first time. "No," he said, then paused. "This dispatch, it mentions a name, a shipping agent my father used. Did your father ever speak of a man named Sterling?" The name was vaguely familiar. I believe so. He was a partner, I think. In one of my father's early ventures." Alistair's focus sharpened. He looked at her intently. "Annalise," he said, using her given name for the first time since their wedding vows. It sounded strange, almost intimate. "I need to know everything you can remember about your father's business dealings, no matter how small." She led him to her sitting room and brought out a small, leather-bound box where she kept her father's few remaining papers. As they sorted through them, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind for months. "Alistair, why? Why me? This elaborate arrangement, it is more than just a convenient contract. It is a penance. But for what?" He stopped, a brittle letter from her father in his hand. The storm raged outside, a fitting soundtrack to the turmoil in the room. He finally looked at her, and the mask was gone. In its place was a weariness so profound it seemed to age him before her eyes. "Because my father ruined yours," he said, his voice raw. The confession hung in the air between them. "Your father was a brilliant man," Alistair continued, his gaze distant. "An inventor, an artist. He designed a new type of chronometer, one that would have revolutionized maritime navigation. My father was his partner. He provided the capital." He gestured to the small wooden bird on her mantelpiece. "Your father carved that for me when I was a boy. He said it was a bird that could always find its way home." Annalise stared at him, her mind reeling. "My father saw the potential of the invention," Alistair went on, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He saw the fortune it would bring. So he cheated your father. He used his superior legal resources to patent the design under his own name, cutting your father out completely. It was the foundation of the Beaumont fortune. It was the theft that sent your family into decline. Your father died a broken man, and I have lived with that knowledge my entire life." It all clicked into place. The ink-stained fingers, the relentless work, the solitary existence. He was not enjoying his fortune, he was managing the proceeds of a crime. "The night of the ball," she whispered. The laugh, a muscle feathered in his jaw. "It was the most despicable thing I have ever done," he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I saw you, I recognized you from a miniature your father once showed me, and I saw your uncle circling, ready to sell you to the highest bidder. I panicked. In that moment, I could think of only one way to make you untouchable, to isolate you from men like him, so I would have time to intervene. It was a monstrous, clumsy, unforgivable act. I had to make you a pariah so that my offer of marriage, when it came, would be the only one you would receive. He had not laughed at her. He had shielded her, in the cruelest way imaginable. My plan, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper, was to marry you, restore your family's fortune from my own, and then fade away, live our separate lives as the contract stipulated. A quiet, lifelong penance. I never anticipated this. He gestured vaguely between them, at the fragile, unspoken thing that had grown in the silence. He was exposed, vulnerable, the truth laid bare at her feet. He then did the one thing she never expected. He went to his study and returned with a key. The key. He unlocked a heavy document box and laid it on the table. These are my father's private ledgers. They show everything: the original partnership agreement, the transfer of the patents, the profits. It is all there, the proof of what was stolen from your family. He pushed the box toward her. The knowledge is yours now. You can use it to ruin me if you wish. It is no less than I deserve. He had handed her the weapon and bared his chest. In that moment, Annalise felt no triumph, only a profound, aching sorrow for the boy who had received a carved bird and the man who had spent his life paying for his father's sins. She now had the truth. The question was what she would do with it. The next 2 days were a blur of intense, focused activity. Annalise, with the key Alistair had given her, did not seek to ruin him. She sought to liberate them both. With Alistair's hesitant permission, she enlisted the help of Mr. Sterling, the solicitor whose name had been the first breadcrumb on the trail. He was an old, shrewd man who remembered her father with fondness, and Alistair's father with a distinct lack of it. Together, they pored over the ledgers. Annalise, with her quiet, methodical mind, proved to be remarkably adept at untangling the complex web of finances. She saw the truth of Alistair's confession, but she also saw something else. Within the records of her uncle's guardianship, cross-referenced with Alistair's information on the family accounts, she found the definitive evidence she had been searching for. Her uncle had not just squandered her inheritance on bad investments. He had systematically embezzled it, using forged documents to secure loans against assets that were legally hers. It was not mismanagement, it was calculated, criminal fraud. She had it all. The proof of the original theft that had built the Beaumont fortune and the proof of the secondary theft that had nearly condemned her to a life of destitution. She held all the power. She did not plan a dramatic arrival in a new carriage to gloat. The carriage, the wealth, the title, they were tools, not trophies. The true victory would be in the claiming of her own agency. She arranged a meeting, not in a public place, but in the heart of Alistair's power, his study. The room that had once been a symbol of his secrets would now be the stage for her liberation. She requested the presence of 2 men, her uncle, Marcus Vance, and Duke Alistair Beaumont. Marcus arrived first, blustering and indignant, assuming he was there to be chastised again. Alistair stood by the fireplace, his face pale and tense, a silent observer waiting for his sentence to be passed. He had ceded all control to her. Annalise entered last. She wore a simple, elegant day dress of dark blue velvet. She felt a strange calm settle over her. This was not the terrified girl from the ballroom. This was a woman who knew her own worth, a worth that had nothing to do with the dress she wore or the man she had married. "Uncle," she began, her voice clear and steady, "you are here to answer for the management of my inheritance." Marcus scoffed. "It was lost to poor markets. I did my best for you, ungrateful girl." "No," Annalise said, her voice cutting through his lies. She laid a single ledger on the great mahogany desk. You did the best for yourself. She proceeded, with chilling precision, to detail his crimes. She cited dates, figures, and account numbers. She explained the forged signatures, the fraudulent loan agreements, the systematic siphoning of her funds into his own failed ventures. She spoke without anger, her words falling like chips of ice. Marcus's face went from ruddy indignation to a pasty, sickly white. He looked wildly at Alistair, as if for help, but the Duke remained silent and still, his eyes fixed on Annalise with an expression of stunned awe. You have two options, Annalise stated, her voice unwavering. Option 1. You will sign this document. She produced a paper drawn up by Sterling, transferring what little remains of your own assets to an account in my name as partial restitution. You will then write a full confession of your fraud to be held by my solicitor. And then you will leave England and never return. If you do this, the matter will remain private. And option 2? He whispered, his voice trembling. Option 2, Annalise said, is that this ledger, along with my testimony, goes directly to the authorities. You will be imprisoned for fraud and embezzlement. Your name will be a disgrace for all time. The choice is yours. It was not a choice. Defeated, utterly broken, Marcus stumbled to the desk and signed the papers with a shaking hand. He did not look at her as he left the room, a ruined man erased by the quiet, determined woman he had so grievously underestimated. Silence descended on the study. Annalise stood by the desk, the signed confession in her hand. She now had her own fortune, reclaimed and secured. She had her freedom. She could walk out of this house, out of this marriage, and build a life of her own, beholden to no one. She turned to face Alistair. He had not moved. He looked at her as if she were a marvel, a creature of impossible strength and grace. The debt is paid, she said softly, referring to the ancient crime of his father. What was stolen has been restored. It is, he agreed, his voice hoarse. You are free, Annalise. You can leave. I will not stop you. His face was a mask of heartbreak and hope. He had given her the power to destroy him, and instead, she had saved herself. She walked toward him, stopping just before him. She looked up into his dark, turbulent eyes. You offered me a partnership once, Your Grace, she said, a faint, true smile touching her lips for the first time. A contract. For a quiet, unobtrusive wife. Annalise, he began, his voice thick with emotion. Is that offer still open? She continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Because I find myself in need of a partner. A quiet, intelligent, and occasionally ruthless man to help me manage a growing portfolio of assets. But this time, it would not be a contract. It would be a marriage, between equals. The hope in his eyes shattered the last of his restraint. Yes, he breathed. Yes, he reached for her then, his hands, no longer stained with ink, but warm and gentle, cupping her face. And when he kissed her, it was not the resolution of a contract, but the beginning of a covenant. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared burdens, and of a love that had grown, impossibly, in the most stony and silent of grounds. 1 year later, the ducal mansion on Grosvenor Square was transformed. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating bowls of fresh flowers and the warm gleam of polished wood. The silence was no longer heavy and oppressive. It was peaceful, punctuated by the murmur of conversation and the distant sound of a city alive with commerce. Annalise, Duchess of Beaumont, stood in the doorway of her own study, a room adjacent to Alistair's that had once been a dusty, forgotten repository for old maps. Now it was her domain. A handsome desk stood by the window, covered not in domestic accounts, but in shipping manifests, investment proposals, and architectural drawings for the restoration of her own family's country estate. A project she was funding herself. She was a partner in Beaumont Consolidated, a silent but influential voice in the company's new, more ethical ventures. Alistair had insisted. He valued her sharp, analytical mind as much as he cherished her quiet strength. He was a changed man. The burden of his father's guilt, now shared and absolved, had been lifted. He smiled more. The severe lines of his face softened by a contentment that had once seemed impossible. The famous carriage, the one she could now afford 100 times over, was often used to take them out of the city, to the green hills where her father's house was slowly being brought back to life. It was a symbol not of triumph over him, but of the future they were building together. The world had seen her return, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of self-creation. Alistair came to stand behind her, his arms circling her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, looking at the papers on her desk. "Mr. Sterling informs me your investment in the American railways is already showing a remarkable profit," he murmured, his voice warm against her ear. "He worries I am becoming more ruthless than you," she replied, leaning back against him. "Never," he said softly. "You are not ruthless. You are just." He turned her in his arms, his gaze full of a deep, abiding love. "Do you ever think of that night? The ball?" Annalise considered it. The memory of the torn dress and the crushing humiliation felt like a story about someone else, a lifetime ago. The Duke who had laughed was gone, replaced by the man who held her now. The timid girl who had cried was gone, replaced by the woman who had claimed her own power. "I think of it as the day I met my husband," she said simply. "A very strange, unpleasant, and ultimately wonderful day." He smiled, a true, easy smile that reached his eyes. He no longer needed to hide behind a mask of severity, and she no longer needed to hide from the world. They had found each other in the ruins of the past and had built something strong and beautiful. Annalise had learned that stillness was not weakness, and that true freedom was not a gift to be given, but a truth to be claimed. And love, she had discovered, could be the most surprising and patient investment of all.